Shalom, shalom. All praises, glory, and honor be unto Yahweh Bashem Nahushai. Double honors unto the apostles and the elders of GMS, who are the true leaders of all Israel on earth today. And salutations to the Akim that are doing this work in truth and sincerity, risking their lives and their freedom to do so. To the confusion of faith Akim that are joined into our ranks. To the hopefully elect and the Akwathium that are listening and learning. To you I say shalom. Once again, all praises, glory, and honor be unto Yahweh Bashem Nahushai, Bahashem Rakah Kadash. This is a recap on the video, how white people, or how Edomites became white people. Okay, how Edomites became white people. And the name of this video is 1681, The Invention of Race, The Laws That Changed the World. All right. By this brother, Philip Shock Matthews, because it's just shock news. It's true. Truth like this is a shock. And the good doctor here, well, she's going to break, he's going to, she's a professor at Xavier University here in Chicago. She's also a former Chicago police officer and a lawyer. So, this is a very learned woman. She has credentials, according to Esau of the yin yang. But before she gets started and exposes her brethren, her people, I'm going to read a couple scriptures. All right. And the first scripture is Ecclesiastes, or the book of Sirach, chapter 21, verse 8. And it reads, "He that buildeth a house with other men's money is like one that gathereth himself stones for the tomb of his burial. The congregation of wicked is like a tow wrapped together, and the end of them is the flame of fire to destroy them." So the so-called white man is going to be destroyed for the wickedness that he's done. Okay? And his pomp is brought low. Okay? Let's get one more scripture. And I'm going to actually, what I quoted, that's in Isaiah 14th chapter. I've been bringing that scripture out a lot. That one in Habakkuk 2:16. Shame upon that glory. Because see, their history, they bragged about being on top, being in control, and this, that, and the other. And now that very history that they've bragged about is starting to be a curse unto them, because what's being revealed is the very true intricacies that are left out of history that's taught in the classroom. From the grade school level to the college level. It's a lot of details that's left out. But this is Isaiah 14:9. It says, "Hell from beneath is moved for thee, to meet thee at thy coming." So it's going to be hellish conditions put on the so-called white man as you see the curses beginning to fall upon him. With the drug overdose problem, the suicide overdose problem, low birth rates, becoming victims of crime. And even though they won't really share with you that most of the crime that's done to them is by other whites, but they'll be quick to put, if Jake is doing a crime against an Edomite anywhere in America, they'll broadcast that. But the true statistics is that 71% of police officers that are killed or attacked in the line of duty, are it's at the hands of other so-called white people. And 86% of crimes that are done against white people is by other white people. Facts. You can go and look. Those are FBI statistics, not mine. So without any further ado, actually, Salakia, let me finish this scripture. This is Isaiah 14:9. It says, "Hell from beneath is moved for thee, to meet thee at thy coming, and it stir up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It have raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations." So war is coming, and it's on the verge. All right. All they shall speak and say unto thee, "Art thou also become as weak as we? Art thou become like unto us?" Verse 10 of verse 11. "Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy vows, the worms is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee." Okay? So the other nations are now challenging and ready to go to war and fight with America, when in years past, the nations feared, but they're not anymore. All right. And that's just a sign of the time, the decline of America, the decline of the so-called white man. And now on Front Street is his fabricated history. And the history you're about to hear is directly connected to it infiltrated every facet of life, especially the Bible. You know, because they created Darwinism, came after this, so-called white supremacy, and all the lies and fictional pseudosciences that promoted it, that helped push it, including those that infiltrated the Christian religion, the made-up religion of Christianity, because they took Ham, Shem, and Japheth and attached pseudoscience to it, which is Negroid, Mongoloid, and Caucasoid. And this is why people are so confused about history. All right? But there is no such thing. All right? So let's let her talk, and let's let this video play, and just let her tell it.
Even worse. Oh, yeah, that's hard. Yeah. It's amazing it's amazing you made it home. I mean, really. The Cubbies. So for as people need to know, we've had many conversations, you and I, many appearances on both the radio show and my live show here, shows with you and Dr. Robin DiAngelo. You were a professor at St. Xavier University in Chicago. You were a former police officer in Chicago, professor of sociology, and you wrote this amazing book that I came to be aware of, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, however long we've been working together, called Birth of a White Nation. And as a matter of fact, I remember reading a blog by Inez Davis.
Yes.
And she quoted you in that blog. And that's how I found out about you. And when I read your work, just that quote I remember, but just reading your book, it put everything in perspective. It was like the biggest aha moment of my life as it related to where does racism come from? It has to be a beginning. We just automatically think that it's always been here. And that's not necessarily the case. We know about American history, but we don't really understand how it came to be. So in recent conversations, you and I, you shared with me that it wasn't just the anti-miscegenation laws of 1681 that was a game changer, but you said it took another 100 years.
The anti-miscegenation laws is basically laws that punished white women, so-called Brits and other white women in this newly created class of people, for marrying men of color, especially Negroes here in America, which were already here, and which were landowners and even slave owners, and most of them were Moors. And Moors were some of the biggest race traders in the history of mankind. All right, I'm going to do a video in the history of Israel. All right, because they came over with Christopher Columbus, as Hebrew interpreters. All right, why? Because Moors were and are Israelites, and they helped to keep perpetually their own people in slavery. Okay, and even some of the Moors here in America owned slaves. All right, and that history is going to come out right here in this video.
After that, to create the construct, the social construct, the lie of construct of race. Right. I said, oh my gosh, I never knew that. So you're just constantly blowing my mind, Doc. But for those who have not watched any of the previous shows, might have been living under the Philippe Matthews show rock, let's bring them first up to what these anti-miscegenation laws are and what they did, and why they did what they did, and then we can go into the deeper aspect of how race was created.
Great. So what's important to note is that prior to this massive rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion, persons of African descent who were free, and there were plenty who were, could vote, and they did. They could run for public office, although I can't find historically anyone who chose to do so.
Those were your
They
Moors.
owned enslaved persons of African descent.
Those were your Moors.
They could own indentured British and other European servants, and they did. And they could marry a person of the opposite sex, regardless of her or his nationality. And they did with abandon. In fact, in one county in Virginia, we know that 50% of the free men of African descent were married to British women.
So there you go. In the 1600s, all right, and especially due to the ratio of women that came over from Europe, 50% of them were with Negroes and Native American men. Okay, this created a problem for the so-called white man, which is the reason it goes to show you that when the so-called black man, Hispanic man, Native American man is in their proper place, the other races don't stand a chance.
And we also know from historical evidence that at least among the masses, of the 99%, if you will, these marriages between persons of European descent and persons of African descent were treated, seemed to be accepted. And how do we know that? We know that because a number of people who were in such marriages were business owners. And we know from their business records, if the community at large would respond negatively to these marriages, you would expect their business to decline, to be rejected by those in the community. And there is no evidence of that whatsoever. We do see signs of resistance to these marriages. And another important piece of historical information we need to know is that in Virginia and Maryland, in the 1600s, there were roughly 10 to 12 men for every one woman. So an incredible gender imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
So
they would literally ship women in from British, literally ship them in.
Literally bring in women. They were in high demand. And so you began to see a law in 1664 passed in the colony of Maryland that punished British women who married enslaved Negro men. And in the language of that law, first of all, the language says British and other freeborn women.
This was the fragility and the insecurity of the so-called white man beginning to shine through.
So that's the group they were concerned with. And what the law did was if such a woman married an enslaved Negro man, she was enslaved for the duration of her husband's life, and any children that they have would be enslaved into their 20s. So if you can imagine putting yourself in the shoes of a large landholder, that's a pretty good deal, right? Your property value goes up the more those marriages occur. And even though in the law of 1664, the lawmakers make it very clear that the purpose for creating this law is to, and I'll quote from the law, to stop these, quote, shameful matches. And it's also clear from this law that they saw the harm that results from those marriages not being something that's an individual harm, which is usually the case in law, but rather was some sort of harm to the British people generally. That's sort of an interesting thing to hold up.
Wow.
And what she just described is basically just the hatred and the discontent between Jacob and Esau. This war that's been going on openly and both hidden, since the time of the separation of the tribes of Israel, and since their scattering.
So, if, as you might well imagine, large landholders, instead of preventing or discouraging these marriages, they were in fact encouraged. And so it wasn't until 1681 that you see lawmakers in Maryland amending that law of 1664 to address what occurred, which is the fact that the marriages were encouraged, not discouraged. And it is in this law where we see language that says, that prohibits or punishes, I should say, British and other white women who marry enslaved Negro men. So now we have this whole new group of humanity called.
Did you hear that? In 1681, it was written into law, which started here in the Americas and spread around the whole world. Over by the time the next over less than 100 years, it had spread around the whole world. This new class of people called white. All right. So when these people talk about how their parents came over here with nothing and blah, 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 and worked hard and, woo up to bam, they came over here to a nation that was set up for people that look like them. That's why the people that were here, or the immigrants, that come of color, have so much more of a harder time than the ones who came over here who were in this new classification of white people. All right. They were the only ones that could have white cake. That's an inside joke.
White people.
That's when white people were illegally invented by law, because there's no record in any European history book of Europeans referring to themselves as white. So white is American made.
Absolutely. Well, it occurred in British colonial North America. We, as we'll see that it's truly American made from the foundings of the United States. But so
this was before the Constitution. Correct. This was before the Constitution.
Well before. So right now we're in the late 1600s.
So when the Constitution was written, it was not written for you so-called Negroes or the people of or the rest of the Northern Kingdom, the so-called Native and Latins either. All right, and the Star Spangled Banner is actually one of the most racist things ever written. All right, because in the third verse of it adamantly tells you that there's no refuge for a Negro. There will be no refuge for them, and they still want you to stand up for this. Yeah.
The last quarter of the 17th century.
Yeah, this is important. This is important because it's before. Wow, 100 years before, and before the first meeting of Congress.
Absolutely. So 100 years before that revolutionary period in what would become the United States, we have the invention of this group of humanity called white people. But here's I always try to get people to really try to imagine. Lawmakers come up with some new label for a group of people. First of all, they only come up with laws to serve some purpose, right? They don't do it for nothing. There's something that has to be served by that. And here's what we know. We know that right before the assertion of this new group of humanity, there was this massive, massive rebellion in the colony of Virginia. And Virginia and Maryland were they certainly had dissimilarities, like the predominant religion, but in many ways they were similar. They both shared that gender imbalance. Both of their economies were completely based in tobacco farming. Because of that, many of their laws and policies, followed each other. So we know that this rebellion in Virginia terrified the ruling elite, and it terrified the corporate investors in England, because their corporate investment was, very much threatened by this rebellion. The rebellion, again, lasted well over a year. It wasn't ultimately quashed until England sent in troops. And the man who the rebellion's named after, he actually died fairly early on from wounds that he received, Nathaniel Bacon. But this rebellion really frightened folks who owned land and who were among the ruling elite and the investors in England.
Which at this time were also called white people, because what also went along with that law of 1681 was all those sellout Moors that were enslaving our own people that were here. They all were stripped of their lands, and a lot of them got sold into and became slaves themselves.
So 1%.
You can't get around the curses. All right, you can accept the more science and become a Muslim all you want. You're still an Israelite and under the curses.
How do they respond? The lawmakers in England, in Virginia, wrote to the Legal Oversight Authority in London, who had legal oversight over the colonies, and said, look, not to worry, we have a plan. it is Theodore Allen's work that really uncovers this discourse that ultimately reveals that they intended to use a divide and conquer.
So that's Theodore Allen, very important name. All right, gonna do some research on him and do a video on Theodore Allen as well, because he was the first one to do all the research that pretty much brought out this 1681 law and this creation of the white race. When people start referring to themselves as white, and then, of course, the white superiority lies that came behind it and that went along with it. When they start talking about black, white, brown, and yellow and all that garbage. There's brown people and there's red people. And the red people are palish. And they're red because their blood shows forth through their skin. And then the rest of the world are different shades of brown, from dark brown to light brown. There's actually no such thing as a white person, and there's no such thing as a black person. Only brown and red in different shades thereof.
Strategy in order to ensure that Bacon's rebellion will never happen again. And they did it. And they did it through the invention of white people. And here's the crazy thing. So you have these lawmakers who've invented this entirely new label for people, never define it as a matter of law, up through to 2000, what year are we? 2017, still have never defined white people. And they did it by, so how did they do this? How did they so successfully create a label, give it meaning that people would quickly get, and completely transform colonial society? And this is how it all worked.
And look what's happening to colonialism now. It's being attacked and it's being exposed. All right? They're literally taking the urban cities back and kicking people out of there. White people, so-called, are being kicked out of South Africa, out of their own apartments. And they're down there preparing for a race war, which the white people are probably going to lose horrifically because they're outnumbered. And all those damn Hamites, all those darkies, all those Hamites down there are armed as well and vicious. All right, and they're angry, which they should be. They have the right, because here they are living poorly. Africa's still probably the richest continent on the earth, right, with natural resources, but yet the people who are born and from there, that God placed in that land, all their wealth is going to this small group of so-called white people, and they're kicking them out. Well, that sentiment is spreading around the world, man. All right, the Edomite he's becoming an endangered species, and he's very much in danger.
They created a whole bundle of laws that gave meaning to whiteness. For example, they passed laws that made it illegal for a person of African descent to run for public office, which means they could before. They passed a law making it illegal for free men of African descent to testify against white people, which means they could before.
So those are two very dangerous things, because if I can't run for public office and I can't testify from you against you, that gives you complete total policy. That means that you can create laws that rule over me and block me out, that I can't get education, I can't work where you work, I can't even go into the same buildings, I have to go into the back door. All right, policy which allows you to buy property, get licenses, own firearms. And then when you commit crimes against me, I can't even testify against you. Post-slavery, those laws really came into place. All right. So the so-called white man has a lot to pay for, and he's starting to pay. Not to mention that he's losing all his assets in the Caribbean. The Caribbean nations are starting to go with break away from the UK and from American and the Brits and from the Taiwanese, because if you know, Taiwan is basically a representation of America, and they're starting to go at Russia and China. So you got same way you got a mess brewing over in the so-called Middle East and Syria. You got one brewing right below America in the Caribbean Sea, where a lot of Americans like to vacation and live. All right, that's going to be my next video. It's getting ready to get very hot down there as well, man. All right, so with that, let me read one last scripture. This is back to this is Sirach 10 and 8. It says, because of unrighteous dealings, injuries, and riches got by deceit, the kingdom is translated from one people to another. So the so-called white man transferred power to himself through violent injuries, lies, and deceit. And now it's time for him to be destroyed. All praises, glory, and honor be unto Yahweh Bashem Abishai and Abba Babal.